Welcome back, YouTube. For this video, we've got something fun and exciting, something brand new we've never done before. We're going to be competing in a game jam. So a game jam is a competition to make the best video game you can on a limited time frame with a given theme. I'm going to be competing in the Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam, which is limited to just 48 hours and a theme you don't know until the game jam begins. And because it wasn't challenging enough to do this by yourself, I'm going to be using Unreal Engine, which is an engine I've never used before. I'm going in, having never even opened it before, and we're going to see what we can do in 48 hours. So let's see how it goes. Okay, while we wait for the big theme reveal, let's talk about what prep I did to get ready for this game jam. Going into the game jam, I had never used Unreal before. Although I've never used it, that didn't stop me from going on YouTube and watching some tutorials about programming C++ in it. I have experience with Unity and obviously my own game engine, but there was a pretty big learning curve I found with Unreal. That said, I still found some good videos and was able to get some valuable information. So although I had never used Unreal before, I went into this with a little bit of an idea of what I was going to be doing. The other thing I did to get ready for the jam was I made a bit of a plan. Obviously I didn't know what the theme was going to be, but one of the things I thought was a good idea was to stick to 2D, just because I was hoping that it would be simpler. Another thing I really wanted to do was focus on my own strengths. I think that that's obviously a really important thing anytime you do anything creative. If you're an artist, you should really be focusing on putting your artwork forward. As a programmer, that's a little bit harder. Like if you make a really well-programmed menu, people don't think like this is really well done. They think this works the way I'd expect. So my plan was going to try to lean on collision and physics and particles in the engine, things that I could hopefully get for free and use that in the game as a large piece. The last part of my plan was just I needed to finish. No matter what, I wanted to release something. It could have been just 1 minute, but that's fine. I wanted to have something that was tight and well done, and no matter what, release something. So upon learning the theme, roles reversed, I had immediately some ideas. The first thing that popped into my head was just this idea of an archery game where instead of the archer, you control the arrow. So I took it to a piece of paper and started sketching out what I thought this idea could look like. Something I always look for anytime I make a new game or come up with a design is I always want to have mechanic ideas. It's always a better idea to have more mechanics that you don't use than to be reaching to the end of the barrel and out of ideas to use. Part of the reason why I went with this idea was I felt like I could execute this well. I knew that this was going to rely heavily on the physics and collision in Unreal, which is obviously well tested and is going to work well. And I felt that I could make an enjoyable game pretty easily and make a good package. That being said, I was pretty aware that with this Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam, oftentimes the winners are these really creative, out there ideas. And I was aware, swapping an archer with its arrow, this isn't exactly reinventing the wheel, but because this was my first game jam and my first time using Unreal, I just wanted to set the bar low and create something that I could be happy with. So the mechanics I had at the time here were avoiding the obstacles in the game. This was kind of goes without saying, you guide the arrow through the different levels. I figured I could make quite a few levels off that. I had the idea of adjusting the launch speed or the direction. I ended up using that. Teleporting the arrow through the world, I thought that was a cool idea. You go through a door and then you end up in another spot in the level. Splitting the arrow into multiple I thought was really fun, where you use the same controls and now you have multiple arrows moving. And the last one here, I had this idea, almost like Ikaruga, where you could press a button and you could maybe move towards the camera into another plane to dodge things. The other mechanic I didn't end up writing down, but I ended up going with, was the idea of hitting a power-up that would invert your controls. So with a basic idea of what I was going to do, I opened up Unreal and started configuring Visual Studio and trying to get everything together and up and running. So I suspect I'm going to be talking about this a fair amount because I ran into quite a few issues as I was working on this. But my big problem that I had while working on this game jam was I had followed all of these guides and I had learned from some C++ guides But all of the Unreal Engine 4 videos I saw, they had a compile button, which is no longer there in 5, and then I guess the 5 videos I watched, I just didn't see people hitting the button. I was trying to use the live compile feature, and I never was actually compiling it inside Unreal, which seemed to be an issue where anytime I would have a crash occur in the game, everything would shut down. And because I hadn't properly compiled everything, on restart, I would lose a bunch of progress. And this is something that repeated many, many times, where if I opened up Unreal again, it would say wasn't able to load this object. And I believe that was because I was not properly compiling it. So I'll call attention to it as it happens, but it's gonna happen a bunch. And I was starting to pull my hair out with all of this. Before the crashing issues begin, I went online and I looked for some tile map assets I could use to build out this archery idea. So I just wanted something that was dark, kind of fantasy, looked nice, and that I would just be able to use to assemble these levels. This was all information that I had learned watching YouTube videos, so I was mostly just repeating what I had learned. I found this great asset on itch that I'll link in the description of the video that I ended up using for my background, as well as for my tile maps and my collision. So I brought that asset into Unreal and I started making a level with it. I set up the collision and I just tried to use that tile map to just build out some basic level where it was pretty straightforward to play through. Once I had my first level, I added a post-processing volume to try and set up with the 2D art, just adjusting for the lit versus unlit once you get to the gameplay and trying to make it all match. I was feeling pretty good about this level, so I figured I need to find a archer to fire this arrow. So once again, I went on itch, and I was able to find this really, really nice elemental archer pack that I used. So I brought that sprite sheet in and I went through and I tried to grab the animations I thought I would use. Because I had access to them, I brought multiple in, even things like if your arrow hits the wall, there's like a hit animation I'll play just because that's all free content I got. And here I have the archer just chilling in the first level. It was at this point I started actually doing some coding, and it's probably worthwhile at this point to contrast Unreal to Unity. So with Unity, you can put scripts on just about every game object, and that's kind of the methodology that you use. You just keep repeating, I can put scripts on anything, any game object can accept input, any game object can detect collisions. And so going into Unreal, that was really what I was expecting. And I was quite surprised by what a difference it is where you write these classes and they all inherit from different classes that already exist. And there's a much more regimented and structured approach to things. So that's a good reason why I crashed quite a few times here. And then, like I said, using the live builds, that really exacerbated things because a lot of times where I would crash, then I would get all of my progress lost. Along with the Archer asset pack, there was an arrow I was able to use, so I brought that into Unreal. I was a little bit annoyed because some of the guides I had followed for doing 2D Unreal, they had this, I think it was a paper character 2D, and I went to use that to create my arrow, and I was a little annoyed because that paper 2D had to have a capsule collider, so that circular shape, when this arrow to me really just needed a rectangle, which was just a pain in the butt of just all of my guides followed inheriting that, and then here it doesn't really fit my arrow very well. So once the arrow was in, my next goal was trying to get the arrow to move on its own and then use input to control the arrow. As we're getting on here, you're going to see I skip over a lot of stuff. There was a lot of class creation, a lot of blueprint messing around with that I just am going to skip over here just because it was inefficient me trying to learn Unreal and how best to create classes. It was at this point here that I got the arrow moving and accepting input to control, but you can see I still don't have collision because I hadn't properly set that up with my tile map. So I built out this test of drawing this wall on the level just to try and make it easier so I don't have to fly the arrow around. And after a fair amount of messing around and crashes, I got the arrow colliding with the wall. At this point, I was still struggling a little bit with the bounding boxes, so you can see the arrow overlaps a little bit, but I was really happy with this progress, because this is a pretty big component of the gameplay. So at this point, I was pretty pleased, and I went through my tile map and I set up the collision on all of the wall objects, and I built out my map a little more. And then I realized I was going to need a target for the arrow to hit. I checked out the assets I had already downloaded and brought in, but none really looked like a great target, so I ended up making my own. It's by no means as nice looking as the royalty-free art I got, but it got the job done and it didn't really stand out or stick out too badly. I brought the target into my level so the arrow could collide with it and I could hopefully detect if a win had happened or not. At this point, I was winding down for the end of the first day, and I was feeling pretty good. I had my target set up, and I was thinking tomorrow I'm going to be able to really make some big progress and hopefully complete the gameplay loop. Day 2 started off with me wanting to get multiple archer animations playing so that you could animate the archer firing an arrow, have the arrow spawn, and then the archer goes back to idling. To make this work, I ended up adding a flipbook component to my archer, and then I added paper flipbooks that had the different animations. And so when you press a button, it would play the firing animation, and then when that was done, it would go to the idle. And then as well, when that firing happened, I needed to have an arrow appear, right? So I initially created my own arrow object, and that arrow inherited from the pawn class, so that whenever the archer would fire, it would create an arrow and send that on its way. Eventually I got that working, so the archer plays its idle animation, when there's an input it plays the firing animation, and then the arrow spawns in, and then you control the arrow. From there, the next challenge was detecting collisions, both when they happen and then trying to determine what the arrow is hitting, so that I can tell, did the arrow just hit a wall and we need to reset, or did it hit the target and now we can move on to the next level. Once I got the collision detection working, I actually had another problem where I was creating the arrow in the scene, and that was taking ownership of the input, and so when it would hit a wall, I was destroying that object, but the ownership of player 1 input wasn't reverting back to the archer. And this is another one of those occurrences where I don't want to say I'm so used to Unity, but I just have been thinking in Unity terms where anyone can access input on any script, that this was a bit of a curveball to have to deal with. Commonly online with Unreal Engine, you want to have a player controller and you just want to adjust which pawns your input is affecting. But I found that with the time constraint, I was really worried about making that whole change and going through, so I kind of wanted to just hack something together that was easier. So what I ended up doing instead was, instead of the arrow directly receiving input, I just had the archer control all of the input, and then it would feed it into the arrow instead. And instead of spawning and deleting the arrow every time I fire or hit a wall, it's just one arrow that gets spawned at the start of the level, and then from there it just gets reset and moved to the right location when you go to fire it. This was a bit of a hack, but for the time constraints, it worked all right. This is going to come up as we keep going here, but this is by no means a guide on how to use Unreal Engine. I don't condone this. If anything, it's like the opposite. It's embarrassing that I went through and hacked this together this way. You should not follow this, but given the time constraint, I was really just trying to get everything up and running and trying to make a playable game in 48 hours. So with firing the arrow working and hitting a wall working, the next step was detecting when I hit the target. And I successfully got this up and running, and so I was really thinking I was motoring at this point. Now I just need to be able to switch to the next level. So I made a second level just to be able to tell when I switch visually that a change has occurred. So with the second level in place, I was beginning to try and switch levels. Once again, going from Unity to Unreal, there's this idea of persistent objects that you have in your level, and then you load the next level with all of the objects that aren't persistent. This seems to exist in Unreal, and I think I would have been able to get this working, but I think that the live building was my biggest issue, and I think that things were crashing every time I would go to load a level. So I ended up really struggling trying to get the next level to load. At this point, I was growing really concerned about these errors that would pop up every time I restarted. Like I say, it's because a proper compile hasn't happened, but not knowing what was going on, I was looking online and people were saying, you gotta delete your binaries. If you delete some temporary folders, you'll be able to get this working. I saw the Visual Studio plugin kept popping up, so I wondered if that was it. And eventually I ended up making a new project. I was wondering, maybe I had messed up. I made a couple classes a couple times that had similar names. I would make them realize that wasn't what I wanted and then make a new one. I wondered if that was part of the issue. So maybe a fresh project. This was actually not an issue at all. Like I said, I just need to do a full compile. But at this point, I'm just thinking, like, I've got all this good progress. I don't want to get to the end of this and I can't ship this game because of these errors. So I go through, I import a bunch of the files from the old project to the new file, or to the new project, which saves some time. I set everything up. It's a little bit cleaner, but really shouldn't have been necessary. I think I learned along the way some valuable insights, but I kind of just got back to where I had left off at this point. So I really struggled with the level loading on this. I kept going through, trying to follow guides online. I wasn't able to get it working. I was still getting these errors. I'd switched the project over. This was really a battle for me. And at this point, you can see in the bottom corner, like, we're getting into the evening. I've been working on this all day. So I ended up hacking together a solution. And so what I did was I added a paper tile map component to the archer, which is actually the level you see in the background. And then I added an array of levels. So as you complete one level, the archer updates which paper tile map is displaying. This is very much a hack and is really not loading anything. It's all persistent throughout the scene. But with this, I was able to make progress and get the next level up and running. So the next problem was around the target. I was going to have these different levels, which are all tile maps, and then the target would either have to stay in the exact same place, or I would have to have a way to move it around the scene with these different tile maps. My first approach was I added the target to each level's tile map. However, the issue that I found was when I had the target inside the level tile map, I just wasn't able to detect what my arrow was colliding with. I don't know, I saw people describe Unreal as not very friendly to 2D, maybe this is related to that, but I just couldn't get the collision info that I needed, and then even trying things like get tile, which should return to me which tile I hit on the tile map, I wasn't able to make work. So I needed a solution to work around this. So what I ended up doing was replicating what I had done before. I added a tile map component, which was the target tile map, and I added an array of tile maps, which would be the target ones, and so I split the targets into their own tile maps. This was quite ugly, but it allowed me to identify if I had hit the target or if I had hit the level itself. So this made it so every single time I made a level, I would make it all in one tile map, I would duplicate it, and then in the level tile map, I would erase the target, and in the target tile map, I would erase the level. And here you can see it successfully working. I was starting to feel pretty good. I had the level loading working, the gameplay was coming along, so I figured it was time to grab some music. So I went to Incompetech, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is a great resource for free music, and I grabbed some free songs. To go along with the music, I wanted to add some sound effects, so I made use of the Game Master Audio Pro Sound Collection I've talked about earlier that I own, and in there I was able to find some sound effects of arrows flying, arrows hitting walls, and just a kind of success noise that I used to play when you beat the level. It was getting on in the evening, but I wanted to really get as much under me as I could that night, the second night, because the next day I only had till 1 p.m. So I started making 5 levels that would just be based around dodging obstacles. I didn't have any extra mechanics in at this point, so I just went through and built out some levels. I made them in the editor, and then I would try them out and adjust them as need be. I didn't mean for these to be that difficult, but they ended up being fairly challenging. But I'm pretty happy. It's a good, compelling game mechanic in the end. With some levels complete, I was beginning to feel pretty confident. At this point, it's like 1 a.m. in this footage, and I figured I would just push for getting a build done just to get that under my belt. The reason why I really wanted to get a build done before the day I was going to release was if I could build the game and make sure everything was running properly, then that takes a big variable out of the picture, right? If I go to finish and there's half an hour left to submit and I can't build the game, I'm going to be pulling my hair out. While I was waiting on the first build, I tried to be productive with my time, and I went through on itch and tried to fill out some of the content for the page just so it would be up and running when I was ready to upload. So I built the game, and lo and behold, when you go to play it, you get a black screen, which was kind of my exact fear I had. With the black screen from the build, I was pretty disheartened. We were getting to 2 a.m. here. I started going online and trying to figure out what I could resolve. There was some issues I was hitting, but fundamentally the big problem I had was still that compiling issue. So I tried really hard to resolve this black screen build issue, but eventually I had to give up. It got to like 3 a.m. and I had to call it. So I went to bed. I think I set my alarm for 8 a.m. the next morning, knowing I was going to have a full day, and the first thing I had to do was get to the bottom of this build issue. It's things like this that are just the worst with game dev, of you just have no idea how long these things are going to take to resolve, and it's just a complete mystery. It ended up being a pretty fast solution once I knew what it was, but when you're in it, you don't know how long it's going to take. Here I am, sitting down to get down to work a little after 8, looking pretty haggard after under 5 hours sleep. It took me a little under an hour that morning to get to the bottom of that build issue and realize that I need to start compiling the code in the Unreal editor. But once that got working, I was able to play the game from the build and had that under my feet. That made me feel a lot better of getting the build working, but I still had this idea that I was going to add in another mechanic and a couple more levels to the game. So I was still a little bit panicked, thinking, you know, this is working now, that's good, but there's still a lot to be done, and it's 9 a.m. at this point, and I have to submit by 1 p.m. So with the pressure on, I began work on another mechanic. Unfortunately, just through time constraints and through the fact that I had to hack together this solution with Unreal, I wasn't able to do any of the mechanics I had written down. So I thought the easiest mechanic I could do would be to have a power-up that if you hit, inverts your controls. So to continue to use my hack-together approach, I added in another tile map component and another array of tile maps, this time for these power-ups. I called them magic, but which was the same deal as the target. It would just draw nothing but the magic power-ups, and that way I could discern if I was hitting them or not. Fortunately, because this power-up was pretty straightforward, I was able to get it working relatively quickly, and then from there I was able to design another 5 levels. I liked trying to experiment with this, just do some different things, sometimes forcing you to use this power-up, sometimes giving you the ability to dodge it. And the last level ended up being quite tricky. It takes definitely quite a few tries to be able to beat. So we were now on to almost 11. The stress was coming on. I knew I needed an end screen for the game, both in terms of if you finish the game, I wanted to just have something to say thanks for playing. And more importantly, I wanted to have a citation for all of the music and artwork I use. That's super important to me. So I knew that this was non-negotiable. At this point, I had cut the idea of a menu. I had cut the idea of having a whatever's rights intro. And this was really the only UI that I was investing in, but I knew I had to have this, so I started work on a thank you screen. After a little bit of messing around with the code, I was able to have the image pop up on screen, and I was able to trigger that whenever you finish the last level. Okay, so at this point we're down to the very last hour. I was really pushing past that thank you screen because I wanted to get to decorating the levels properly. You can see in a lot of these, the first level I did a pretty good job. That was the first one I made, of having the trim on all of the edges and having some little brick details in the background. I wanted to go back through and make sure with the remaining levels that there was some amount of detail to this. So I hurriedly rushed through and started decorating all of these levels. With the levels decorated and somewhat looking more cohesive, I created a final build and began uploading it to the itch page. I still had 30 minutes, but I just didn't know what to expect with the itch upload, how fast it would go or not. And in my last 15 minutes, I threw together a title card for the itch page, just to have it look a little bit more polished, and then I did some editing on the itch page. So after a stressful and tumultuous 48 hours of many Unreal crashes and learning lessons the hard way, let's see what the end result looks like and if you can tell or not. Ultimately, I was quite pleased with the final result. Obviously, there was a lot of chaos in making the game, but I was really happy with how it turned out, and it's a fun game and just takes a couple minutes to play all the way through, but it's super satisfying to be able to, at the end of a weekend, post a completed project and have it be available for the internet. I did have to cut a lot of items, and there is even some bugs, like for instance, I wasn't able to make enough time to fix the music, where after one song finishes, that's it, it doesn't play the next one. I wasn't able to get back to that. This whole experience was super interesting for me of learning Unreal, and the one thing I have to admit, no matter what, is it's really nice to, when you're done with a project, be able to release it and know it's going to play everywhere, rather than with my engine when I finish my game, having to worry about, is this going to crash for people? Is there going to be an issue with different hardware? It's nice to know you have some confidence in using Unreal. In terms of what I've learned from this project, I definitely learned not to underestimate Unreal, that there's a lot of nuances for me still to learn there. I think I also kind of took away having art assets on itch that you can use. It's incredible how polished a game you can make in a short amount of time. That really blew me away. And I don't know if this is really much of a lesson learned, but something I definitely took away from this is just how nice it is to be able to really focus on making a game and in a short time period create something. I think it's easy to get really caught up in the minutia and all of the bugs and releases and all of the issues in making a big paid game. It's nice just to focus on something small and get back to remembering why you enjoy making games, which I really think this weekend brought that out for me. And that's it. By some miracle, I was able to finish the game on time and put together a pretty fun game. It's up on itch now. I'll put a link in the description. It's free to play, so go give it a download and give it a play. I'd love it if you would. Let me know what you think about the video. I know it was something new for us. This was the longest video I've ever made, so it took a lot longer to edit than I thought it would, but let me know if you enjoyed it. Otherwise, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll see you in the next one.